we want to talk about a little bit about treaties today, okay? I am very comfortable being interrupted, okay? So don't be shy about interrupting me, asking questions, making comments, telling stories, because that's part of conversation, okay? So I welcome it. It usually makes the exchange richer by using that way of communicating. So treaties, what are they? And why are they important? Well, most of you will remember your own education. Okay, you went to school somewhere for a number of years, 8 years, 9 years, 12 years, 15 years, depends how slow you were, but anyway, okay. But in that education, do you recall anything being said about treaties? Not likely. I have not heard too many people say, "Oh, I heard that in grade 5," or "I heard that in grade 12." Generally, the education system in this country has been very narrow in its focus, especially in telling the story of Canada. Its focus has been very much about settlement, about moving westward, about the many battles that were fought. That's been the focus. Not much about people as such. Not much about community. And so, as a consequence then, treaty has been a part of our Canadian story that has not been well serviced by education. So today, since about 1996, in Saskatchewan, it's been the focus of trying to reawaken what treaty is, where it rests in our lives as a nation, and as communities, and as families, and where it should take us. That's the most important part. Where should it take us as Canadians? Now, how to go about doing that? Well, first of all, we have to acknowledge that treaty is not an Indian thing. That's the first assumption that has to be parked in a corner somewhere and allowed to rest there forever. It's not an Indian thing. Up until 1996, that was the stereotype we had to live with. Somebody said treaty, that's an Indian problem, so park that. The second assumption that I like to deal with is that history did not begin in 1492. Sorry, but that's not. History goes back thousands of years. And how do I know that? Well, I've started listening to the Cree creation story. That's a very long story. I haven't even touched the preface to that story. But nevertheless, I've heard enough to tell me that history goes way back. When the creation story has references about dinosaurs in it, it tells you, there's the people on this land are very aware of where they are, what it represents, and that it goes way back. So history, that's a stereotype that needs to be parked. Didn't start in 1492. It's just a different chapter in 1492. Okay? Another chapter in 1867. You know, there's different parts to this very long story. And that's the way we have to accept who we are as Canadians. Okay? So, that's second stereotype. The third, I think, stereotype that we have to deal with as part of the treaty story is that treaties occur between nations. And that's a big one. That's a big one that we have to grapple with in our society. Go ahead.
How would you define nation, please?
How would you define what?
Nation.
Nation? Nation it has its own sovereign, I guess, existence and recognition. And historically, regardless of where you go in the world, where groups are negotiating or figuring out how to live with each other and putting it down in some form for both sides to recognize, treaties are defined as agreements that occur between sovereign entities. Go ahead.
Will you be explaining a bit about the difference between, or how it evolved from being between Indigenous nations and England and Indigenous nations in Canada? Will you be doing that later?
Okay, I'll get there. Okay, yeah, I'll get there. But we have to recognize that's one of the items, and Canada legally accepts that definition because it incorporates it into the Constitution of Canada. It's in there, and in many of its agreements with First Nations today, it pays lip service to that concept of nation to nation. And I think that in the 100-year history of the numbered treaties that have been signed here in Canada, that's the reason why the First Nations have worked so hard to keep Canada aware that it signed. It is a recipient of these agreements, and that there are responsibilities attached to those agreements. Now, the other piece that we have to put on the table and acknowledge is that there are two distinct, it's not just sovereignty, but there are two distinct worldviews in societies, and each one has developed different styles of communicating and recording its history. The whole treaty part of who we are as Canadians is caught up in that tension. Okay. So in 1876, in my country, and that treaty stretches out way out here. It goes to the Rocky Mountains, and the signings happen in different locations. But one of the signings, the one that affects my community, occurred at Fort Carlton, just a few miles from where I live, in 1876, August the 23rd. The setting or the context of that agreement, we have to understand it. We have to understand how it unfolded. First of all, we have to acknowledge that Britain, via Canada, Ottawa, and Alexander Morris, who was the Treaty Commissioner for Fort Carleton, their mode of communicating was primarily writing. Okay, they wrote. They kept books. They wrote books, and so Alexander Morris arrived with his retinue of secretaries and people to do the recording on his behalf. So that's one side. On the other side, Chief Mistawasis, Chief Katakakup, Chief Sweetgrass, Chief Katoeha, all of these leaders of individual Cree units who formed the large Cree nation that stretches across this country. They're all organized in separate units because that was what worked in their economic system and in their social structure. Their primary mode of recording history was oral. Oral. People were trained to know the stories and to pass those stories on from one generation to the next. It was primarily oral, the oral method of remembering who they are, where they came from, and all the laws and the regulations that that were developed by that society. They're all done through an oral system of communicating and keeping the organization functioning from that perspective. So they arrived to the treaty table with their way. So the consequence then is this. First of all, they have to solve the language problem, because one side is speaking Cree only, the other side is speaking English only. So interpreters come into play. And you know what interpreters, you have to trust your interpreter. You have to trust that they're going to be know the spirit of what is being said and be able to say it in another language. So they solved that problem, and so negotiations happened, and as the negotiations happens, the writers over here are writing down, and the people over here are remembering. They're capturing the intent and the meaning of that treaty in two different ways. So what happens in Canada then is that these people go back to Ottawa and they publish an official version of what they heard, and that's where it ends for 100 years. And so we have half a story for 100 years. That's a problem we have to deal with.
In legalese.
Pardon?
They publish it in legalese.
That's right. Yeah, they publish it in the language of the of their worldview, you know, and their legal system. So in 1996, then, that was what in Saskatchewan, the Treaty Commissioner in Saskatchewan began to address. The other half of that story. And so today, what, 25 years later, we're much richer as Canadians because of the of recognizing that there is a whole other interpretation of that agreement on this side that comes from the oral tradition. And what they did in Saskatchewan was, in recognition that the oral tradition, the oral way of remembering was beginning to get weak, and it wasn't passing down as in the same way that it had in previous generations. Was they gathered up elders, Kehteya, from all across the province, and had them sit for days on end giving them a place and the time to tell what they knew about what was passed on to them about the story of treaty. And then they took that information and they organized it, and you'll see on the back table there I brought Harold Cardinal, was a very wise man, contributed a lot to Canada, and Walter Hildebrand worked together, and they took this stuff and they wrote the oral version down. It's not complete, but they did. They identified some of the key issues around that treaty. So we have that today, and I brought a copy of that book. It's called Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan. If you're really interested in knowing the full story, you need to read that, and you need to read Alexander Morris's version, and the other one that is a really good piece of work is Miller's and Tuft's book on Bounty and Benevolence is the title of the book. But it's all about the story of treaty in Canada.
There's another book.
Go ahead.
It's called No Surrender.
Okay.
And so it's newly out. And 1990, the government was getting afraid of the stories that were coming from First Nations. So they published this. And so every time, the only thing they say about the treaty is surrender and how many acres were surrendered.
Yeah.
And the other book is No Surrender. So
Okay.
they're trying to maintain the status quo that they established.
Definitely. Definitely. They wouldn't be the Canadian government if they weren't. Okay. So you're leading me into the next section here. So we have this, we're beginning to have this, the fuller story. And so what comes out, what comes out really strongly in this fuller story is that on one side, Alexander Morris's primary concern is land surrender. You know, all the other pieces in those treaties 1 to 11, they're sort of secondary concerns. The primary concern is, how much land am I going to get out of this? You know, are you going to sign on to? So that's the big concern over here. Over here, it's all about people. Relationship building. It's about wakotuin, it's about miuichetuin, it's about pimatsisuin. All of these are Cree concepts of relationship inside of their own society, but also with the neighbors. So the side of the story that we haven't been hearing is about the people side. And so as we go forward, we deal with the land question, and part of the land question, the dilemma we face today as Canadians, is that we're forever seeing claims being brought forward to correct the wrong that has followed in the 100 years since the signing of those treaties. You know, so the federal government is busy constantly trying to rectify the mistakes it inherited from previous administrations, and the First Nations are beginning to. Not beginning, but have always been very conscious of what was intended, and that's where you get into spirit and intent of treaty. What was intended, and then establishing a process of rectifying the gaps in the relationship that was intended in those treaties. So today we have, if you went to Ottawa to the Claims Commission, you'd see hundreds of claims against Canada, all on the basis of a lack of or improper implementation of the treaty relationship between us and the settlers that came here and their representatives. So that's what we've inherited. So what do we do with it? And we'll talk about that this afternoon. You know, where does this take us, and where's the hope here? You know, what hope can we build out of the kind of the messy legacy that we've received from lack of attention to the people side of that treaty. Any questions on that around treaties? Go ahead.
Can you just expand on the negotiations, what they negotiated for?
Okay. Okay. So I'll start by putting to rest some other stereotypes. Because of the colonizing process here in Canada, the power play that has been going on for 400 years here in Canada between Indigenous people and the settlers that were coming in first, the fur traders, etc. I don't know, the uneducated population. The Indigenous population is not sophisticated and it's not educated. That's the stereotype, okay? We need to put that one to rest. And that's the reason why I brought that really thick book called Atakakup. Because that's probably the best example that I've run across. It tells a story of, an altogether different story about sophistication and worldly knowledge and ability to plan and to respond to vision. One example of that occurred prior to 1876, you know, the signing where Atakakup was the lead voice for the Cree people. Mistawasis and Atakakup worked very closely together, both very well accepted in the Cree community as leaders and also accepted by the people around Fort Carlton, etc. during that time period. Mistawasis and Atakakup realized things are changing. They're going to change even more. Number one, our economy has just folded. The buffalo no longer existed. That was the basis of their economy. The fur trade had collapsed. British people stopped wearing beaver hats. They were out of fashion. Okay, so it collapsed. And so they knew all of this. Atakakup and Mistawasis knew all of this. And they knew change was coming and that things were never going to be the same. So what Atakakup did was he sent his brother to Ottawa. Now you think about that in 1875, 1874. That's a major trip. There's no WestJet. So he sent his brother down there. He said, go and check this out. Bring back a witness account of what you see. And so his brother comes back and tells him, oh God, there's a lot of those people out there, you know, and they all want to move out here. And they got these big cities. So he gave a witness account, an eyewitness account of what was happening down east, which fed then into Atakakup and Mistawasis and the people that they were into their into considering what are their options, because it was inevitable this population was going to be here. Okay, and they're not far off. You know, you look at today and big cities out here. Anyway, so to prepare their people, then they began to talk about, you know, what is our best option. They knew what was happening down south of 49. They knew what was happening. You know, the wars, the utter destruction of peoples by violence, and they knew that's not an option for us. And so they did their planning. They did their internal counseling, consultation. So when they came to meet Alexander Morris, they were prepared. They knew some of the things that they wanted to bargain for and work towards. And so there are things like education. They recognized that writing had a certain power to it. So we need to get our people learning how to write and read, and education was important. So they did that. And Atakop even went further. He started sending his own people to train as teachers with the Anglican Church. And so very quickly he had his own people running one-room school in their community. So this is the kind of stuff that we don't hear about, you know. They're very smart people. Otherwise, they wouldn't have survived, and they wouldn't be here today. Very adaptive, borrowers, but recognizing always what is the strength of their own culture, which is people are important. Being related to people is important. That's the foundation of who we are as a people. So our base value that we work from is wakotuin, being related. And so we take that to the treaty table and we say, we'll share with you this land that sustains us. We'll share with you because we want to be related. And that's the approach that was taken by the oral societies. Okay, so what are some things they negotiated on? On this side, the primary concern was survival and maintenance of their worldview, and that is a primary concern on this side. On this side it was land and what concessions they could give to get that land to this group over here. And so you get inside of that treaty there's items like, well, I said education was one of them. Chief Mr. Wasses really worked hard on health care. They call it a medicine box. And for about 100 years, the Canadian government took that literally, medicine box, and they would bring this first aid box to one of the old Aggie and on our reserve, and she handed out cough syrup and cod liver oil. And but in today's world, we recognize that in today's terms, that is health care. That was health care that was negotiated for. You know, there's all kinds of pieces in there dealing with the farming economy. You know, animals, implements, transportation. They're all in there. You know, in bits and pieces. The interesting one is at the bottom of Treaty 6. It says that we can never have alcohol on our reserve. That's one is kind of ignored. you know, across the board. But it very, very clearly says no alcohol on reserve. I guess it made sense back then. But some of us like our glass of wine. So, you're okay with that? Yeah. Keep going.
I just had a question as far as the church's role and participation in the signing of the treaties and also the interpretation of the treaties, what both sides were saying or agreeing to. How much, you know, has the church been involved in that? And also, how much has the church been involved in the, I guess, encouraging the government to, you know, live up to the treaties?
Okay. Where I would start off on that one is this: it's not church policy. It was never a church policy for its workers or its ministers to get involved in these in the affairs of treaty making. It's individuals who took upon themselves a sense of responsibility to take either sides on the negotiations and to wield influence on the people, either negatively or positively, depending which treaty you're looking at and which personalities you're looking at inside of that treaty. But it can't be ignored that they carried. These individuals carried with them the umbrella of the church's influence and used it to impact what was happening at the treaty tables. Take for example Treaty 10 that deals with mostly the small group of Cree, but mostly Dene people in northwestern Saskatchewan. There are stories there of the Catholic priest being very actively involved in promoting and pushing and trying to influence the Dene people to sign onto that treaty without regard for the protest that was coming from inside the communities against some of the terms of Treaty 10, to the point where that particular priest really dishonored the role of women in the Dene culture and making decisions, major decisions like this, using his European thinking about the relationship or the place of women in these kinds of negotiations and making that. So that's an example of a very negative participation by one individual inside of the Catholic Church. But I think it's really important to remember it's the individuals that made decisions to get involved. It wasn't the church as a policy or a way of doing things that was driving this. Okay, it was the freedom of the local parish priest to make those decisions.
But it was also the fact that the priests were educated, and they felt that because of that they knew what.
Well, they could read and write in their own culture, and so they felt in the colonizing mind to be superior to somebody who can remember a 36-day creation story word for word. That's the context. Go ahead, Lucy.
How many treaties exist? How many are there in Canada?
They're probably in the hundreds. There are treaties covering every part of this country, going to the first encounter between the Mi'kmaq and Maliseets of Eastern Canada and going westward. And the treaties are still being signed. British Columbia, has been signing treaties most recently. Nisga'a Treaty, just barely 20 years ago. The Chawasan Treaty that was signed probably about 6 or 7 years ago. Treaties are being signed today. And here, I think you had the experience of the Lubicon, the Lubicon situation. That's a treaty issue. That's one of the things that needed to be corrected in Alberta.
I understood that there were still places in Canada that don't have treaties.
Mostly in British Columbia. British Columbia.
In Canada, they don't have the numbered treaties, do they?
They don't have what?
Numbered treaties in, I thought Treaty 12 was the last.
Treaty 11 was the last numbered treaty, yeah.
So what do they do in Quebec and Maritimes?
There are treaties in Quebec. There are treaties in Quebec.
Numbered treaties.
They're not numbered treaties. They have specific names to them. Like there's the 2 Wampum Treaty between the Iroquois and it would have been the French-English back then.
In the 1850s, or when were they signed?
Oh, 2 Wampum goes back into the 1700s.
Okay.
Yeah, because they've been in contact with with the Europeans going back to the 1500s and down east.
In contact, but I didn't know there were treaties per se.
Well, one of the famous ones that they just celebrated a few years ago in Nova Scotia was between actually it was between the Catholic Church and the Mi'kmaq, where they signed an agreement on the basis of conversion, and they celebrated that. Well, it's still a treaty. Yeah, it's a treaty of a different nature.
So it wasn't involving land?
No.
Okay, so
No.
not all treaties are about land?
No, they're not. Like the 2 Wampum Treaty is more about relationship than it is about land. The 2 Wampum captures the spirit of 2 nations living side by side in peace and harmony, and knowing where the common ground is, and that's where they touch each other. So it's less about land than it is about the way we need to live together. So there's all kinds of variations, but in the more recent ones, the characteristics of those treaties have been more in terms of land and in relationship to the government of Canada. Sort of the 2 primary focuses of those treaties.
I have a question. So you're saying, when the treaties were formed, the government was after land, the Aboriginals were after relationship, right? Okay, so if we revisit those, are we trying to, as we hear the oral, are we trying to put that together as a complete package with honoring both halves? Or what's happening with that as they gather that oral tradition?
There's it depends where you are in Canada. There are many different strategies occurring out there.
Depends on the people, right?
Right. Yeah. And my sense, I can't hang this on anything except a gut feeling, but I don't think we can approach this as a kind of a one-size-fits-all across Canada. We can't do it that way. It's been tried, and it's all it's done is cause frustration and disillusionment. I think the answer lies in either dealing in treaty areas, but in smaller units. In smaller units, yeah. Like the Treaty 4 people in southern Saskatchewan and Manitoba have tried really hard to maintain a unified front in establishing a relationship with the government of Canada. I think that's one format, and I think in Alberta, I'm not too familiar with the politics here and the way things are done. But I think the Treaty 7 peoples tend to operate as a unit, and then you have a Treaty 8 up north, I think, right? And so, you know, it's different ways in different parts of this country, and I think that's the only way we're going to come to. This thing is going to evolve into a way of life for us in Canada. Anyway. Go ahead.
So the number 1 through 11.
Yeah.
You know, I kind of have an idea of what they say, but where can I go to actually read those treaties? So that or at least a summary of what they say.
The easiest place to go is the ISC website. It changes its name every 2 years, so we don't know where they're hiding.
They are hiding.
Yeah, but ISC website is the best place to go to, and you just follow the trail, and it'll give you the Morris's version.
Okay. And
But
what does ISC stand for? I'm sorry. I don't know.
Indigenous Services Canada.
Okay.
Is that what Indian and Northern Affairs is?
It used to be Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. It used to be Indian Affairs. It has a lot of names,
Oh, yeah.
a lot of aliases. But I would encourage you, don't stop your reading there.
No.
Get a hold of that Treaty Elders of Saskatchewan, and it puts things into a broader context, you know, a deeper understanding. Yeah. Where are we at?
I'd make one comment maybe on the question about the church's role. And certainly there was complicity in that thought system of residential schools. But you know, have you seen the movie God's Explorers? God's Explorers. Yes. Yeah. It's a good movie to look at. It kind of gives a good picture of that. But in that movie, we learn that the Superior General of the Oblates, Theodore Labouré, in 1935, came to Canada and saw what was happening and told the Oblates they had lost their way and the vision of the founder, St. Eugene. They should leave the schools, go back to living with the people, and back to basics. But at that time, they were too entrenched in what they were doing, and so there was no change, unfortunately. So there was a lot of complicity, a lot of involvement. You know, the schools were making money. There was also that competition, who's going to get there first, and that type of thing. I remember Austin Tatusis telling me the story at a men's conference at Saskatoon, how in Dallas, the residential school there, the priest in chapel one day talked about this man who was against the schools, and it was his father, John Tatusis. And so he was kind of branded as somebody who was, I think he was called, you know, this man was like almost like evil or devilish or whatever. And so he grew up with that kind of brand, which is unfortunate, you know, when you think that happened. On the other hand, there was a lot of really good work that was done. I know that Father Jacques Beauchat in the Northwest Territories at Grandin College, it's probably the only school in the country that had no allegations or anything when this whole TRC thing started, and trained most of the leaders in the Northwest Territories. And so you had really a broad spectrum, both sides. So. And I think Mike, yes?
Didn't also Brandon go to Ottawa a few times, sort of vouching for the Native people? Did he make some trips over there to Ottawa?
There are, I guess, along the same principle, the same idea. You know, individual. Where there's people who harm the Indigenous people, there are also the ones that were advocates, and they did it as like a personal decision on their part. Yes, definitely there are advocates out there. There were advocates, and I think in some ways there are still advocates out there to get a handle on this on this relationship that that's gone wrong in Canada.